about 15, 20 minutes. So I'll just open up the floor. If you could keep your comments brief so that we can get as many in as possible.
By the way, I don't know who's going to win the American election.
Talk a bit and explain to us what you put in that definition of populism that you talked about before. Because when we hear about populism, you know, we hear about both Trump and Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn, UKIP, Le Pen, Beppe Grillo. You said Amami Party, Modi. I get the sense, and you constantly make this reference to rationality versus irrationality. I get the sense that populism is starting to become everything that isn't technocratic moderate centrism. Now, maybe that's an unfair judgment, but I'm just curious.
That's a very fair question. I don't have, and certainly the Pew Research Center doesn't have a definition of populism, right? And you know, it's kind of in the eye of the beholder, right? And you have populism of the left and populism of the right. You know, in Europe, for example. In most countries, the populist rising seems to be on the right. Not in Spain, it's just the opposite. It's on the left. In Greece, it's on the left for the most part. So I guess my short definition of it, my personal short definition of it would be anti-elite and anti-establishment, which we see certainly in Europe and the United States. A decline in faith of the major institutions of the traditional institutions of a democratic society: government, corporations, unions, the courts, the parliament, etc. Dramatic declines in support for those. To a certain extent, decline in faith in the elites in general, which means a decline in the faith in science and other expertise in the society. Most of this, I would say, is my personal view, is anecdotal, where you go and you give a talk to the average general public where there might be some skeptics about a particular policy issue. And I can tell you my own personal experience has been you very rapidly realize they don't disagree with what you're saying, they just don't trust you. And because you are part of the elite, you must be suspect. And I think that's a broader issue in advanced democratic societies. It's not that we can't theoretically come up with a different way to make public policy decisions in a democracy. It's just practically we've never done it that way. So you see this rise in Europe in the demand for referendum on almost everything. I mean, the Dutch just had a referendum on should we have a free trade agreement with Ukraine. That's the kind of thing we're going to start moving towards. There's a growing support in Europe for more referenda on membership in the EU. There's growing support in Europe that, for example, demands that the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, which has been signed between Europe and Canada, would have to be approved by all 28 parliaments. Well, frankly, that's a power that was given to Brussels in 1957. And there seems to be a sense that we want to roll that back. We asked, for example, in a survey last year in Germany, do you want future trade agreements to be negotiated by Brussels or by Berlin? And the German public said we want it to be negotiated by Berlin. Again, I mean, that is a what is that, 60-some-year-old, 70-some-year-old power that people want to now take back. So we're beginning, I think that's a piece of it, anti-elitism, anti-establishment institutions. It certainly is, to a certain extent, nativism, and we see this both in Europe and the United States. Fear of the other, but also a sense that we've asked these questions both in Europe and the U.S., and they've been asked for a long time, actually, in the United States. What does it mean to be a true American? What does it mean to be a true German or a true Pole? And it's interesting, and it's interesting to think about it in your own context. Think about, how would I answer these questions? I mean, do you have to speak the language to be a true American? Do you have to speak English to be a true American? How do you hear that question? Is it to function in my society you have to speak English, or is it more deep-rooted. You have to speak English to be an American. I would argue you don't have to speak English to be an American, but you probably need to speak English to function in the society. We find that in both Europe and the United States, no, you have to speak the local language, Polish or German, to be a true German or whatever. Do you have to accept our customs and culture? Again, overwhelmingly, in most societies, people say yes. But again, I don't know how I'd answer that question. I might say yes to that too. I mean, if somebody comes to my society and says, well, in my society we're allowed to beat our wives, I'd say, well, we don't do that here. You can't claim the right to do that because, if you're an American, you got to follow our customs and traditions. But then you get into other questions. Do you have to be born here to be considered a true German or a true Pole or a true American? Most people say yes to that, or many societies people say yes to that, which calls into question the theory of diversity, right? And then the one I love, because it's the most disturbing, 50% of Americans say you have to be Christian to be an American. Think of that. My wife's Jewish, by the way. I find that really offensive. But in places like Greece or Poland, people say, no, you have to be Catholic to be a true Greek. So that's again, that nativism is there, but widely shared. In terms of populism, clearly the economic stuff, the rising concern about inequality, the rising worry about the future of the economy, the slow growth, the income issues, I think are also deeply. But again, I would argue that populism is about a range of issues that aren't just economic. And I think the danger we all face, because I would dare say most of us have taken economics, is to believe that economics is the answer to everything. I think it would make all of this easier to deal with. And the fact that it's arising at a time when there's rising inequality and slow growth should tell us something that how important economics is. But I would suggest to you, I can't prove this with the data, but I think intuitively we better assume that it's more than just economics.
Can I just, there are lots of people, I don't know whether we'll be able to get everybody in. Just one question to see how you think about this one. So in the data you presented, actually, on the whole, the data wasn't as dispiriting as this rise of populism makes it sound, right? As a global phenomenon. Actually, the numbers for many countries, which you think the data might be worse, France, for example, actually looked, almost all the measures, right? Openness, diversity, Germany looked pretty good. And so I want to tie that observation with the observation you made that the more specific the question, the more likely you're going to get division and so forth. At a high level of abstract principle, there's more consensus, right? Is one way of putting the two together, right? That there is actually something a lot more contingent about the kind of event. I hate to use the word, but is there almost something kind of postmodern about our politics? In the sense that there is a kind of underlying momentum, which still is actually not in a bad direction overall. But there is something about specific moments or specific events that's actually crystallizing sort of either opposition or the demand for, unmediated kinds of politics. And in that sense, is it a political problem as opposed to a sort of deep-rooted structure? Because a lot hangs on how you judge.
Sure.
Judge that. Just if you had a thought on that, or.
Well, I think it's a really good question because is the rise of Donald Trump, for example, in the United States, is it totally attributable to these kind of various populist issues? Because clearly people who support Donald Trump tend to espouse a lot of these populist resentments. But to what extent is it just a result of the fact there were 17 people running for a Republican nomination to president, and he had been a reality TV star, and did that create advantages for him that allowed him to succeed? Or on the third hand, is it that he had intuitive sense of how to exploit these resentments in a way that nobody else did and recognized them in a way that nobody else did? And frankly, I don't think we know, but I think it's fair to say that's probably all of the above. The same with what's happening in Europe. Yes, it's true that Germany has taken 1 million immigrants. This has clearly harmed Merkel's popularity and the popularity of her party, given rise to the AfD. But they still only are getting like 15, 20% in these state elections. I thought it was interesting that the head of the AfD was quoted today in the paper based on what happened in Mecklenburg and Berlin, saying, "We think we're going to get double digits in the national election." Well, I'm sorry, if you'll get 12%, I mean, that doesn't mean you won, But from a German perspective, 12% for the AfD would be a huge thing. It is interesting. We have a study coming out next month looking at what are the attitudes that are shared by people who support the AfD or the Front National or UKIP or what all these right-wing populist parties. What's the kind of grouping of values and attitudes that people who support those have? And it's very distinct. It's a clear separation with the attitudes of the population. It tends to be driven by anti-refugee, anti-Muslim sentiment, and then anti-Europe sentiment is second. The economy actually is the third and not the leading driver. So there is a distinguished. But the reality is, even in those countries where this is a huge problem, in France, for example, you still don't have 50% of the population supporting the Front National. Now, what's interesting and what we're trying to do in this study, and we aren't done yet, and I don't know if we can do it, is I want to look at, okay, here are the values and attitudes that define a right-wing populist support. How many of those attitudes are shared by other people in the society? Yeah. Because that then gives you a sense of what the ceiling could be for their electoral support. Because the reality is, we know that people don't vote on a plethora of issues and kind of make an amalgam and make a list, and there's like vote for the people who share most of they tend to kind of focus on one issue, and then we know this from the interviews with people in the United States who support Trump. And again, we got to remind ourselves, these are emotions, these aren't necessarily, don't sound to us like rational, but people will say things like, yeah, a lot of the things he says upset me, but he's not going to do that stuff. What I like is the fact that he speaks his mind. Now, you want to say to people, yeah, but what he says, do you agree with that? I mean, the fact that he just speaks his mind, I mean, anybody can speak their mind. But, it gets down to those basic sense that he doesn't talk like a politician. And he seems to be giving voice to the frustrations and resentments that I've deeply harbored, which I think go beyond economics.
Varun?
Yeah.
I have a question on on the difference in perception between the Democrats and the Republicans.
Yes, yeah.
And particularly on trade.
Yeah.
Where what struck me was that 30 years ago, 40 years ago,
Absolutely.
it's a flip.
Yeah.
And it seems to be very similar flip in the case of racism.
Yeah.
The Republicans and the Lincoln era today.
Sure.
Sure. Does this indicate that there is a kind of a political convergence that has taken place, and which is why the lack of faith in the institutions is a reflection of that political convergence? And the response to that is what you are describing.
I hadn't thought about the latter point, so I don't know whether, but I can tell you what is interesting is that trade is a perfect example. The narrative we all carry in our heads, and this, I mean everybody, including people in Washington, is Democrats are protectionists and Republicans are free traders. I can show you a dozen different polls by a dozen different organizations. This is just no longer the case, and hasn't been for a while. And so we have to ask, well, how is that be? I mean, you know, the fights in Congress are still between Republicans and Democrats on trade, and the Democrats are more protectionist than Republicans. What you're seeing in Capitol Hill these days is a fight between special interests, between the business community and the labor community who support different parties. In the general public, what you see is Democrats are more free traders and Republicans are more protectionist. And the question then you have to ask is why? And I would submit to you it's because the demography of the two parties has changed, and this may also be the case on race, where the Republican Party is increasingly a party made up of old white men. So on trade, and maybe on race, I don't know, I haven't thought about it that much, these are people who, from their life experience, feel aggrieved about these issues. And so they voice these opinions about trade or whatever. Whereas the Democratic Party is increasingly a party of women, young people, and minorities. And our surveys clearly show on trade, women, young people, and minorities are more supportive of trade. So in a way, it has nothing to do with trade and everything to do with the changing composition of the political parties in the United States.
I thought one of the early perpetrators of populism was João Pedro.
I'm sorry, what was?
Pedro
Yeah.
in Argentina.
Oh, right, yeah, oh, right, yeah.
I thought he was one of the first
Yes,
to do this kind of thing. And our own Kejriwal
yeah.
is another. But you have not mentioned that as a background. Is that not an important part of how populism has developed in lots of countries in Latin America and elsewhere?
Frankly, I haven't thought about that very much, to be honest. I just don't know. I mean, obviously, Perón had some of these elements in his appeal to the working class, that they appeal to their aggrievements. I can tell you I'm in the process of reading a book called Nixon Land, which is a book about the rise of Richard Nixon. And what is amazing to me is you read some of the ways in which some of the attitudes of Americans in 1968 and the way in which Nixon appealed to those attitudes, and you say this is an exact parallel to the United States today and Trump. It means things haven't changed that much in some way, and it also means that smart politicians can figure out ways to appeal to, in a populist sense, to these range of sentiments, everything from fear of the other to fear of crime to worries about the economy and trade in particular.
Just push on that. I mean, what you just said sounds quite plausible, and that's why I think the question of the distinction between the deeper underlying.
Yeah.
So, what's distinctive, right, about populism as in Trump, right, is for the first time you have a populist candidate in the United States, maybe not since the 19th century, and that's the only other analogy you can think of, who openly avows breaching of what one thought was a deep constitutional settlement, right?
Yeah.
So even Nixon, for everything, so the nativism has always been there, the supremacist has always been there, the anti-free trader has always been there, the I don't trust Congress, I don't trust any of the intermediate institutions, I mean all of that stuff has been there, right? The tipping point and what makes, in a sense, this kind of brand distinctive is a cultural and constitutional articulation that you thought was outside of the horizon of any populist movement in America. I mean, you know, the idea that Putin would be an example. I mean, you know, it's reaching an American constitutional contract of the kind you could not, right? So, what in a sense explains that difference and that breach, right? And that's what at the core worries one about, right? Because previously one used to say, look, there is always white supremacists, all of that stuff, but the institutions will be strong enough.
Well, I'm not so sure I see the connection with the Putin stuff, except that...
No, this is an example that he feels free to be able to express that.
To tell you a funny anecdote, we did ask last year in the American public what they thought about Putin, and only 20% of Americans had a favorable view of Putin. And I was giving a lecture in Berlin, and I said, you know, I must admit, I've never met any of these people. And somebody raised their hand and said, well, I'm from Tennessee, I know a lot of them. You know? So I do think there's this attraction to authoritarianism that we shouldn't totally dismiss.
Exactly.
We don't have data to really get at that, but we're thinking of trying to ask some questions to kind of get at authoritarian tendencies among some people. I wouldn't suggest it's a majority of the population, but still, that sense of, you know, kind of we need, and I think it goes back to, my sense is, to the decline in faith in the institutions and the elites. And to the extent that is both widespread and deeply seated in some people, what are the knock-on implications of that? And one of them could be, I don't know, is well, we need to then breach these constitutional limits. You know, I do know some people who argue that you know, Trump might exercise disregard for some of the norms. That, because, you know, some of these are laws, you can't do certain things, and some of them are just, we don't do it that way. And then there's like the testing. I mean, for example, George W. Bush used more executive orders than Clinton did. And Obama's now used more executive orders than Bush did. Executive orders are in that gray area where are they legal, are they not? You know, the way some of these happen, by the way, in our system is, you know, the president will sign a law into, you know, Congress will pass a law, the president will sign it and say, but provisions X, Y, and Z I'm not going to enforce. Really? I mean, is that true to the system or not? We don't know. I mean, the president's lawyers say it is, and the Congress's lawyers say it isn't. But we also have the same issue in Congress, where the Republican Congress has used the filibuster not just incrementally more than its predecessors, but historically more. I mean, in the first 2 years of the Obama administration, 80% of legislation was filibuster. By comparison, during the height of the civil rights struggle in the United States in the 1960s, 8% of legislation was filibuster. So this is not an incremental, oh, same old, they're just doing a little bit more. This is a totally different way of governing. And, you know, do you then, and does this come back to, we have such little faith in the institutions that we begin to go extra institutional and that's an issue. That's a fascinating question, which, if Donald Trump is elected, I think is likely to be more a test than if Clinton's elected, because I think it'll be more. But if she has a Republican Congress, what does she do? I mean, that's another issue.
We're running out of time, so we just briefly
connect
2 or 3 points and then answer.
The phenomenon of populism and the state we're discussing it here, but how long is it going to be before people everywhere on this populist phenomenon? The actual record, the historical record of populist regimes and governments, I imagine is not particularly good. Is that going to act as a drag on the continuing
Should we just connect the two so we can just very briefly?
Yes, in the rise of populism, surely the collapse of a universalist ideology like communism has played a role, because at least on the theoretical plane they claim that regardless of our race, blood, etc., we could all build a better world. So the collapse of that ideology perhaps has played a role, and then the emergence of international migration.
because of which many communities feel they are losing their patrimonial territories too. So these twin factors, on the one hand, the decline of a universalist ideology, and on the other, world migration.
Anupam and Dr. Majidam quickly, and then
Maybe
we'll give Bruce the last word.
I'd suggest that the eruption of populism in Western Europe and the United States should be seen as the outcome of the Great Recession. There is a parallel of the Great Depression. On that occasion, the whole political systems was disrupted, and it gave rise to fascism, communism, everything else. Now, the Great Recession wasn't as disruptive as the Great Depression, and the difference now is that there are no alternative ideologies on offer, but and you could say that Trump or Le Pen or Lafarge are not potential Mussolinis or Hitlers. Fair enough. But I think the generalized sort of explanation for this really quite sudden upsurge of complete loss of trust in the existing systems and real pessimism about the future can be paralleled with the 1920s.
Yeah. My question actually drills down to, I think, two of your key points.
Yeah.
One is it's not just economics, and the other is that affective psychology rules the game.
Yeah.
So there were two serious studies which have been published recently. One was this Gallup one, which basically looks at and debunks pretty much all the economic theories behind Trump rise. The only takeaway is that it is either the fear of the other, but if you actually are willing to be politically incorrect or politically a little more provocative, it's really saying race matters. It's really tied to race. What do you think of that? Because you also had one or two questions which shed light on that. Secondly, the part about affective part, two studies which were cited in the New York Times in January. One was from Yale and Princeton. I don't remember the authors except for the second one. Basically talked about partisan bias, and which pointed out that actually it's not just as they were saying, what you said, that all the things about Obama's record are actually not believed, but it's also when people are recalling and learning, they are actually biased in that. And I think these are considered, these are two very solid studies. Where do you come out after this survey?
Those are really great questions. I don't. The issue of how people interpret reality based on their pre-existing bias, it seems to me, is troubling in the sense that it suggests that the kind of delegitimization and disinformation that it can be engaged upon by one side or the other politically. We know, for example, that Mitch McConnell, the Republican head of the Senate, on the night that Obama was sworn in 2009, said our challenge for the next 4 years is to delegitimate this guy. And then they went ahead and tried to do that. And, the whole birther movement, he's not even born, and it was part of that. That study, which I'm aware of, suggests that this works, basically. That it so distorts people's visions of reality that you can't penetrate it with quote-unquote facts, right? And if that, to the extent that they're right about that, and I don't know if they're right, but if they're right, we have a real problem, because it says to the Democrats, if Trump is elected, or the Republicans, if Clinton is elected, well, our job is really just to delegitimate this person, and if we delegitimate them, we can win the next election. And that is a road to perdition, I would suggest to you, for the country. On your point about race, this is a hotly debated topic in the United States. I do know that the founder of the Pew Research Center, Annie Cohen, who's no longer with us, at the time of 2008, wrote a very controversial article saying this is about race. I don't know if it is or it isn't, but people I do respect, like Andy Coe, I thought that race played a huge part in this. And it's interesting because he was the head of Gallup for 10 years, so I mean, there's some tradition there. You raise a very interesting point, sir, and I think that's one that's totally underappreciated. I have for long said that one of the problems facing modern capitalism today is there is no coherent, intellectually consistent alternative critique. That doesn't mean that we should bring back communism and wasn't that wonderful and it's too bad it's gone. I don't mean that at all. It's just that for years you had a consistently intellectually coherent analysis of the existing state of affairs and an offered alternative. We don't have that now. We're frustrated with the current system. It would be useful, it seems to me, in a thesis and antithesis kind of Hegelian sense, if we had a intellectually consistent, rigorous alternative to the existing system, so that these debates could be in a more formed fashion. And right now you just have complaints, which are legitimate complaints. People think they're legitimate anyway. But so what's the alternative? And we don't have that. And that gets to your point about populism. The history of populism is not very strong, but I do think that when people are just satisfied and frustrated, this leads to that kind of critique. But what the world is that people want that comes out of that populist is not at all clear. Certainly, it's more what I'm against than what I'm for. And to go to your points, again, it gets back to the question of there is no kind of socialist utopia alternative out there that it has credibility, and does that kind of feed frustration because people have nothing else to hold on to? In the 1930s, rightly or wrongly, there were people who said, no, communism is the answer, capitalism has failed. Now we got people saying, well, capitalism has failed, I don't have an alternative. That leads to a more disparate kind of free-floating political reaction, it seems to me. Frankly, I don't have an answer to that question. I don't know what the alternative to capitalism is that would satisfy these populist yearnings. And I think the broader challenge we face is that because, again, I was trained in economics, and I suppose many of you were, I can think up of a half a dozen things we could do to deal with these economic issues, all of which I think are legitimate, and half of them wouldn't work, and half of them would never get published, would never get passed by Congresses. But anyway, the point is, I can think of all sorts of things we could do about the economy. What do you do to address the nativist concerns people have? The sense that immigration is, we are now much more a world of immigrants than we've ever been. There are more people moving around the world. That's part of globalization. Whether it's good or bad, I can't imagine we can stop it. And frankly, I'm not in favor of stopping it, but still, even if you could, I don't know how you would. But that fear of the other is excited by that, and how do we address that? Without endorsing people's racism or whatever. What do you do about the fact that women are now increasingly fully fledged players in the world in ways that they weren't even in my youth, let alone our grandfather's youth, and that minorities play a bigger role in our societies than they did before, in many of our societies, that gay people are out of the closet now finally, at least in many societies. And you don't want to endorse people's homophobia and their racism and their sexism and their misogyny. But on the other hand, they are telling us through the political system, we're uneasy with this, and we're going to vote for people who say, I'm going to take you back to an earlier time when we didn't have to deal with these issues, when those people were under control. And so there are political consequences of our inability to address this resistance to change. And I think that that's the real challenge that we all face as societies, especially in the West.
On that sobering note, thank you so much for stimulating so many conversations. I'm sure we'll be talking about a lot of this stuff after you've left, but you have a standing invitation from us whenever you're in India to sort of come and historically enlighten us. But thanks so much for
This was a great conversation. Thank you. I enjoyed it. Great journal, too.
Have you done one of your periodic